3 years ago, I started avoiding my best friend. I removed her from my life as best as I could, even though back then she meant the world to me. I started avoiding her out of fear, a fear that her uncle put into me. I thought I'd be safe this way, and that she'd be safe. But now we're in the biggest mess you could ever imagine. She's changed into something that could destroy all of our lives, and I think it might be my fault. Oh my god, your room hasn't changed a bit. I nervously laughed as she headed into my bedroom. For a moment she stood there awkwardly, like she didn't know how to act around me anymore. And I was feeling similar. It didn't feel the way it did back when we were 13 and never alone, because we always had each other. The tense feeling only added the absurd situation we found ourselves in. Because this morning, I witnessed that there was something inside of Lana. Something dark and dangerous. Sure it has, I mumbled just as awkwardly and followed her into my room, which was an absolute mess. Bed not made, clothes everywhere. I tried to casually kick a pair of boxers under my bed, but then remembered that I had bigger things to worry about. My mind was woozy, and I found it hard to grasp the events that brought Lana to my room. We both live in this big apartment complex, but hadn't been in each other's place for years. Suddenly, something snapped me right back to the moment. I walked up to my window and stared at the sky. "Why is it dark out?" I asked. Lana came closer, but stayed silent. I live on the 13th floor, which gives a pretty decent view of the city. There were lights radiating from buildings, street lamps, and cars. But the sky was dark. A normal thing to see at night, or very early in the morning, except it wasn't. I remembered again. Lana and I were 3 levels up in the apartment of her family before we came down to the home I share with my mom. And when we were up there, the sun was shining. It was shining because it wasn't even noon yet. A few minutes down, the elevator had drained the sky. This was impossible. My entire body started to tense as I wondered if this was her, if the end was coming, or if those two things might inevitably be connected. What the fuck is going on? I almost shouted. I don't know. She whispered and wrapped her arms around herself. I tried to control my thoughts and got my phone out of my pocket. The clock showed that it was 9 p.m. and I had a bunch of texts from friends that I was supposed to meet at the gym this morning. Lana, I showed her the screen of my phone. I didn't know if I could trust her. She scared me, but I still brought her home with me. Why? For a reason I wasn't sure I was ready to admit myself. She bit her lip, as she always used to when she was nervous. Noah? I sighed. I couldn't even believe what I was about to ask because this whole mess was so absurd. Did something happen in the past 12 hours, or so that I somehow don't remember? Maybe, she replied after a little while. I'm not sure. I stared at her, trying to somehow read her, but it was impossible. I really don't know. I don't even understand any of this either. I swear. Her voice slightly broke at the end. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But she had to be lying. This whole shit, she inherited it. Maybe she didn't want it, but she had to know. Her family was dangerous. I seen that with my own eyes. I swallowed. So what now? She didn't respond, but sat down on my bed instead. I have such a headache. I think it is settling in. I didn't ask what she meant by that, because now all the memories of this morning came back to me. The events that took place before Lana and I came back down to my home. This morning was one of the most peculiar and fucked up things I ever witnessed. I still felt sick when I thought about it, and now I had this massive gap in my memory on top of it. The scariest part was how much power she had. I watched her seize control of a grown man's mind in a matter of minutes. She could control anyone. "I'm your daughter," she hissed through her split-up tongue. Her gaze was only focused on her father. Her eyes were gone, and the sockets were filled with what looked like dread of eternity. Blood dripped on her hands as she pressed her unusual long nails into fist. "You trust me?" The most beautiful thing about Lana has always been her smile. She had that big toothpaste smile that'd make me say yes to all of her stupid ideas back when we were kids. Back when she meant everything to me. Before the incident. Now she was fucking terrifying. Like I'd never seen her before. "You love me?" I stood there, frozen in the kitchen of my former best friend. Pieces of watermelon were spread all over their table. The room was filled with a scent of mint and caraway seeds. I'd found her outside earlier that same morning, out of her mind because something unusual was happening to her body. She was changing and it scared her. I thought she was scared, but now that we're in her home, I realized she wasn't the victim. And that brings me to the saddest part of this scene. Lana's father sitting in front of the table, shivering with fear. It was an odd and painful sensation seeing him like that. Even if I hadn't talked much to Lana and her family in the past years, this image didn't fit the one I always had of her father. A few years back, I'd spent every Tuesday and Thursday evening in the taxi of Dil Ayad. That's when Evan, Lana's brother, and I were in the same soccer club. My mother never cared where I was or how I'd get home, but Mr. Ayad would make sure both his son and I got home safe. Don't question me. I'd never seen Lana like this before. The sheer look of determinism. She was radiating so much confidence that I even almost believed her when she said everything was fine. But it wasn't. Of course, it wasn't. I'd seen her outside on the playground earlier that morning, completely spaced out as if her soul had moved to a different world. She seemed scared and vulnerable, which is why I offered to bring her home. Maybe that creature was taking her over, which I admit isn't easy to comprehend, but she was still Lana, the first girl I ever had a crush on. But now that we are in her home, with her father, she let this dark side take over entirely. I can't say if she was losing control or gaining it. "You are fine." Her father never looked as weak as he did at that moment, and the longer she spoke, the calmer he seemed. His body was both relaxed and tense at the same time. The expression of anger that he had when we came in was slowly morphing into a smile, but at the same time a tear rolled down his cheek. It was her. I never knew how frightening calmness could be. The total lack of reaction. She was controlling him, brainwashing him, making him stop feeling things. Or at least, that's what it looked like on the outside. And I had to make sure the same wouldn't happen to me. I stood there in shock, watching this scene that felt entirely absurd until Mr. Ayad suddenly got up and started cleaning the kitchen. He grabbed a cloth, turned to the kitchen table, and started rubbing it on the table, making bits of watermelon spread everywhere. He was acting like a human. and then he started humming a song. One I faintly remember because he always played it when I was in the taxi. I never understood the words because the song was Kurdish, but I remember the melody. He used to say that this was his mother's favorite song, which made this whole scene even more heartbreaking. Another tear rolled down his cheek while the corners of his mouth stayed upward, like they were being pulled up with a string. And even though I hadn't spent time with his family for years, even though I hadn't been in this apartment since I was 13, I couldn't just leave. A part of me felt like I had to protect Mr. Ayad from a 16-year-old girl who was also his daughter. He grabbed the wet cloth tightly in his hand, water dripping down, and then swiftly turned all the way around, facing me directly. "Noah, what an odd sight. What brings you here?" he said in a very monotone voice. My voice broke before I could say anything else. "We have to do a project for school," Lana said with surprising ease in her voice. Her appearance was normal again. I suppose she somehow changed back while I was distracted. Her cheeks were red and she looked exhausted, but her big brown eyes were back. There was still blood on her hands, but her father didn't notice. He didn't notice anything. Dill looked at his wrist without a watch. "School? It's Saturday, right?" Lana replied something I didn't understand in Kurdish. Good, he whispered. Then he slowly passed us and went to his bedroom. Lana let out a deep sigh and then broke down on the ground. This was the moment I should have left. I should have run away because this wasn't the girl I used to be friends with. This was a creature that could scramble my mind and rip it into pieces. But when I saw her on the ground, face buried in her arms while she let out an occasional sob, I didn't feel scared. I'd seen once before how dark the world could be, and I simply couldn't leave her alone and let things take over. Even if we stopped talking, I felt like I knew her, understood her. She wasn't evil. "Where's your mom and your brother?" I asked carefully. This whole scene was already more than overwhelming, but I couldn't imagine what else would happen if the rest of her family got back. Lana shrugged. "I think you should get out of here before they come home," I said. "We should get out of here." And this brings me back to the demon in my bed. Lana sat down on my bed, staring at the ground while the madness was slowly catching up to her. I was still standing next to the window, not sure if I should get closer to her or not. I don't know why it's night. I don't understand any of this. I'm not in charge anymore. "Noah, I didn't mean to." She took a deep breath. "Didn't mean to do whatever it was I did to my dad. He looked so scared, but then he was okay, right?" She looked at me with her big amber eyes. I didn't know what to say. She really did sound genuine. Who would be able to make sense of this? I sat down next to her, tried to reassure her, although I doubt I sounded convincing. "I need to go home. My mom, my dad, they'll wonder where I am," she mumbled. I wasn't sure if her father really would, or rather if he would have enough control over his mind to do so. "Maybe you should stay here," I said, surprising myself. "For tonight." Even more surprisingly, Lana nodded and texted her parents that she was staying with a friend. I doubt she mentioned me though. We meant to research together, figure out what could be happening. We were reading something about tarot cards and demons on some weird forum, but Lana could hardly keep her eyes open, and I was exhausted as well. Whatever happened that day drained us. I thought about sleeping on the sofa in the living room, but my mom would come home eventually. While I doubt she would care that there was a girl in my room, I'm not sure how she'd feel about a demon girl. I realize how stupid this sounds, but at the playground this morning, she said something. "Are your eyes open?" This question, I'd heard it before and it was connected to something good. But I didn't know what else to do. And I knew that inside Lana had to remember our past too. She wouldn't hurt me. So I lay down next to her. I could hear her quietly breathing in and out, her body slightly moving with each breath. She'd fallen asleep almost right away. At least this way she couldn't tell how hard my heart was racing. I told myself it was out of fear, but I don't know. And everything was relatively fine. My eyes got heavier, and after a while, all the thoughts were gone. That is until I looked right back into the abyss. I don't even know how late it was, but it was still dark. I woke up because I felt something. Something was breathing onto my face, and when I opened my eyes, I saw her, piercing those black holes of eyes through me. Her expression was dark and confident, and when she spoke, her voice sounded slightly distorted. "You are hiding something." "She knows." "Lana, calm down." She was hunched over me, her hands leaning on my shoulders. If she dug those nails into them, I'd get some decent scars. "You're seeing this. You saw it earlier. You saw this thing and you decided to take me home with you. I don't even trust myself, but you do. We're not even friends anymore." I felt a small sting in my chest when she said that, but shrugged it off. "No normal person would simply accept this. So, Noah, what's going on?" My breathing got heavier. She has to know. Or maybe she didn't, and I left her alone all those years like a coward just because I was too scared. There's something I never told her. Years ago, Evan took me with him to his uncle's mansion. He'd spoken so highly of him. I had no idea he was the most frightening and evil man I'd ever meet. I had heard whispers from the other boys in the neighborhood about him. Soren Ayad, head of the infamous Ayad clan. I heard about all the shady business he pulls, and if drugs were all he was involved in, I would have tried to ignore it. But that evening I saw what I wasn't supposed to see. A dark and confusing ceremony that I still find hard to understand. A ceremony with blood and sacrifice, and some sort of cards. That's not when I found out her uncle collects demons, but also when he threatened my life and hers, if I ever looked into any of this. If I didn't stay away from her. I guess I messed up, but I'm not leaving her again. We're in this together now. Shout out to my superfans, Sweet Black Swan, Tacey, and Brooklyn. I really appreciate you guys supporting my channel, and I really look forward to making more content for everyone.